Bob Newhart stopped mid-sentence on the Tonight Show stage and said something that made Johnny Carson set down his pencil for the first time in 12 years of hosting. Not because it was funny, because it was the last thing anyone expected a comedian to say out loud on national television. The audience of 280 people inside NBC studios in Burbank went absolutely silent. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet. Ed McMahon looked at Johnny, Johnny looked at Bob, and in that stillness, the man who had built an entire career on making America laugh through a telephone admitted the one thing he had been hiding since the very first night anyone put a microphone in front of him. It was July 2nd, 1974. The Tonight Show had been taped since 5:30 that afternoon. The summer air outside was thick and warm, and inside Studio One the lights were burning the way they always did, hot and indifferent to whatever was happening beneath them. Bob Newhart sat in the guest chair wearing that red blazer, the plaid trousers, the wide geometric tie that was somehow both wrong and exactly right for a man who had never quite fit the mold of anyone Hollywood expected him to be. He looked comfortable. He always looked comfortable. That was the trick. That was the whole magnificent lie that Bob Newhart had been performing for 14 years without a single person in America ever seeing the seams. But Johnny Carson had been watching people for a long time, and Johnny Carson saw the seams. What he did with what he saw that July night would never be broadcast in full. Not because the network buried it, not because anyone asked them to, but because what happened in the final 7 minutes of that conversation was so private, so unexpectedly human, that both men agreed without discussing it that some things belonged only to the room where they happened. This is that story, and the secret at the center of it has everything to do with a phone call Bob Newhart made on a Tuesday morning in the winter of 1958 that he has never spoken about publicly, not once, not to his wife, not to his manager, not to the late-night host sitting 3 feet away from him who was about to hear it for the very first time. If this story already has you leaning forward, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because what Bob Newhart said next changed something in Johnny Carson that the man carried for the rest of his life. Let's go back to the beginning, not to the stage, to a small apartment in Chicago. 1958. Bob Newhart was 28 years old, and he was failing. Not failing the way performers fail, with dramatic exits and public collapses. Failing the quiet way, the invisible way. The way that happens when a man goes to work every morning at a job he is perfectly capable of performing and comes home every night knowing that capable is the saddest word in the English language. He had studied accounting at Loyola University. He had passed his exams. He had taken a position at a firm where the ceilings were low and the carpets were beige and the days had a texture like wet paper. He sat at a desk. He moved numbers from one column to another. He did nothing wrong. He was never late. He was never rude. He was never fired. And every single morning he woke up with the feeling that he was disappearing. Not slowly, all at once. The way a radio station cuts out when you drive past a certain point and suddenly there is nothing but static where the music used to be. He had started doing something at night to keep himself from disappearing completely. He and a friend had begun recording telephone monologues in his apartment, just for the two of them, just to see what happened when you let a joke breathe differently than anyone had let a joke breathe before. Quieter, more confused. More like the way real people actually talk when they are not sure what is expected of them. Bob did not shout. Bob did not perform. Bob just talked, and the material that came out of those sessions was unlike anything either of them had heard. But on a Tuesday morning in February of 1958, Bob Newhart sat at his accounting desk, picked up the telephone, and called his mother. He told her he was going to quit, not the accounting job, everything. He was going to stop recording the monologues. He was going to stop trying. He was going to find something that asked less of him and give it everything he had left, which was not much. His mother listened. She was quiet for a long time. And then she said something so simple that Bob would spend the next 16 years trying to figure out why it had worked. She said, "Bob, "You are the funniest person I have ever known, and if you quit now, I will never forgive you." He did not quit that Tuesday, but here is what nobody knew. He almost called back. He sat at that desk for 3 more hours and almost called back to tell her he was quitting anyway, that her faith in him was the cruelest thing she could have given him, that it would have been easier if she had just agreed. He did not call back. He went home. He picked up the telephone. He started recording. And 14 months later, The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart was the #1 album in the country, knocking out Frank Sinatra. It won the Grammy for Album of the Year. It made Bob Newhart famous overnight in the specific way that overnight fame happens, which is to say it happened after years of everything else. But here is what July 2nd, 1974 has to do with any of this. Stay with me because we are only at the surface. The segment that night had started the way Bob Newhart segments always started, which was precisely the way audiences expected and precisely the way Bob intended. He sat down, he adjusted the geometric tie, he gave Johnny that slightly baffled look, the one that said he was perpetually surprised to find himself in rooms this nice. The audience laughed before he said a word because Bob Newhart had the rare gift of making his own bewilderment feel like the beginning of a joke. For 18 minutes, everything was light and professional and warm. They talked about the new television season. They talked about Chicago, because both men had roots in the Midwest and shared an unspoken understanding that Los Angeles was a place you worked in, not a place you were from. Johnny mentioned that the Bob Newhart Show, now in its 3rd season on CBS, had become one of the most quietly beloved comedies on American television, and Bob said something that got a laugh, but that Johnny did not quite let go of. He said, "I keep waiting for someone to figure out they made a mistake." The audience laughed. Johnny penciled something on his notepad and looked up. He waited a beat longer than he needed to. That was the thing about Johnny Carson that most people never understood. Everybody thought his talent was the joke. His real talent was the pause after. It was not what happened next. It was what happened in the half-second before the next thing happened, the place where the real answer lived, the one the guest had not planned to give. "What do you mean by that, Bob?" Not a question exactly, more like an open door. And Bob Newhart, who had spent 16 years building an artful, well-constructed room with no open doors, walked straight through it. The laughter had barely finished settling when he leaned forward in that red blazer and said something that dropped the temperature in the studio by 10 degrees. "I mean, I have spent my entire career waiting for a phone call that tells me the first one was an accident." The audience gave a small, uncertain laugh, the kind you give when you are not sure if the funny person is still being funny. Subscribe right now, because what happens in the next 60 seconds will change the way you think about confidence forever. Drop your location in the comments. I want to know where in the world this story is reaching tonight. Johnny set down his pencil. He had not set down his pencil in the middle of a segment in 12 years. Bob saw it happen. Everybody saw it happen, but nobody quite understood what it meant yet. Johnny leaned forward, not the professional lean, the television posture he had refined into something like a physical form of attention. This was different. This was the lean of a man who recognized something. "You actually believe that," Johnny said. Bob held his hands very still in his lap. The geometric tie sat slightly crooked against his shirt. The studio had gone the kind of quiet that only happens when 280 people simultaneously decide not to move. "Yeah," Bob said. "I do." And then, because silence on television is a living thing and it was pressing against him from every direction, Bob Newhart said the thing he had never said to anyone. "I have a drawer in my desk at home. And in that drawer there is a piece of paper I wrote in 1958, before any of this, when I was still doing accounting. It is a list of reasons why I should stop. And I have never thrown it away. And I look at it sometimes, still, now." This week, the audience did not laugh. No one laughed. Johnny Carson's hands were flat on his desk and very still. Ed McMahon had stopped moving entirely. "Why?" Johnny said. "Not why do you look at it. something more specific. He already knew why. He was asking something else. Why have you never thrown it away? Bob took a breath that the microphone caught clearly enough that you could hear it in the back row. Because, he said, I think I keep it so I can be ready, in case the call comes, in case somebody figures it out, and if it is already written down, if the reasons are already there in my own handwriting, then maybe it will hurt less. The studio was completely still, not the dramatic stillness of crisis, the deeper stillness of recognition, the kind that settles over a room when someone says the true thing that everyone in the room has privately thought but never said out loud in front of witnesses. What Bob Newhart had just described was not failure, it was not depression, it was something more specific and more universal than either of those things. It was the experience of success that never quite convinces you, the applause that lands but does not stick, the reviews that say exactly what you hoped they would say and leave you feeling, for one terrible moment, like a man who just got away with something. Johnny Carson knew this feeling. He knew it the way you know the sound of your own voice on a recording, wrong and too close and unmistakably yours. For 30 seconds he said nothing. The cameras kept rolling. The director in the booth made no move to cut. What happened next has been described by 3 separate crew members who were there that night, all of them saying some version of the same thing. They said Johnny Carson looked like a man who had just been handed a mirror he had not asked for. He looked at it anyway. Johnny, Bob said quietly, "Did I just kill the segment?" A laugh moved through the audience like a slow wave, grateful and a little wet at the edges. Johnny shook his head. "No," he said, "you just saved it." And then Johnny Carson, the man who had built 11 years of career on the discipline of never giving more than the moment required, did something that no producer had ever seen him do mid-interview. He told the truth back. Not a performer's truth, not a prepared vulnerability, the kind that gets workshopped in dressing rooms and delivered at exactly the right moment for maximum effect. The raw kind, the kind that arrives without planning. He said, "I have a version of that drawer too, not a piece of paper, something else. Every morning before I come in here, there is a moment in the car, just before I pull into the parking structure, and I think, today is the day they figure it out." Every single morning for 11 years. The audience made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a laugh. Something between. Bob Newhart looked at Johnny Carson with an expression that had nothing to do with comedy and everything to do with what it costs to build a life on making other people comfortable while you are quietly terrified inside. Neither man spoke for a moment. The clock on the studio wall moved. The lights stayed hot and indifferent overhead. This is where you need to stay with me, because what comes next is the part that nobody planned and nobody could have planned, and the part that both men would carry with them long after the cameras went dark. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now, because this ending will stay with you. Tell me where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments right now. It was Bob who spoke first, and when he did, his voice had a texture in it that had not been there at the beginning of the segment. Not the telephone voice, the slightly befuddled instrument he had refined into something close to perfect, something underneath that, something Midwestern and quiet and direct. He said, "Do you know what the worst part is, Johnny? The worst part is not the fear. The worst part is that I have done this long enough to know the fear does not go away. And somewhere along the line I started to think that meant something was wrong with me, that everyone else had something I did not have. This thing inside them that said, yes, this is right, this belongs to me, I have earned it, and it will not be taken back." Johnny looked at him. "Bob," he said, "nobody has that." The room shifted again. It shifted the way rooms shift when the thing that needed to be said finally gets said, and everyone present feels the change in pressure, the slight release, as if a window has been opened in a space that had been sealed for a very long time. "Nobody has that," Johnny said again, more quietly this time. "The ones who seem like they have it are just better at the drawer. They have better paper. They organize the reasons more neatly. But the drawer is there, for all of us. For every single person in this room and every person watching at home, the drawer is there." Bob Newhart sat with that for a moment. He adjusted the geometric tie. He looked out at the audience with that expression of mild bewilderment that had made him famous, except this time the bewilderment was real and it had nothing to do with a bit. Then he said the thing that Johnny Carson would quote 11 years later in a private letter that has never been made public. A letter that Bob Newhart's family found after Johnny's death in 2005 among papers his estate was sorting. The letter described what happened next and quoted what Bob said almost word for word, because Johnny had written it down that same evening when he got home from the studio while the words were still warm. Bob said, "I guess the real question is not whether the fear goes away. The real question is whether you are willing to be afraid in public for the rest of your life, because that is what this job actually is. That is what we are both actually doing, walking out in front of people and being afraid and doing it anyway and calling it comedy, because if you called it what it actually was, nobody would buy a ticket." The audience was very still. Then someone started to laugh. Not the reflexive laugh, the one that comes from the relief of recognizing a joke's shape. A slower laugh, fuller, the kind that rises from a place below the diaphragm when something is funny and also deeply true at the same time. More people joined it, then more. Then the whole room was laughing, and both men were laughing with them, and the moment had transformed without either of them quite seeing it happen, the way the best moments always do. When the segment ended, Johnny walked Bob to the edge of the stage. The cameras had stopped rolling. The floor manager was calling for the next break. In the quiet corridor just behind the curtain, Bob paused. He said, "I probably should not have said any of that on television." Johnny looked at him for a beat. Then he said, "You should have said it 20 years ago." Both men understood what that meant. Neither of them said anything else. They shook hands the way Midwesterners shake hands, quick, firm, without theater. And then Bob Newhart walked down the corridor toward the green room, and Johnny Carson walked back out under the lights, and the evening continued in the way evenings on The Tonight Show always continued, because the machine did not stop. It never stopped. And that was the whole point, and also the hardest part. What the cameras captured that night became something that the people who worked at NBC talked about for a long time afterward. Not the segment itself, though that was unusual enough. What they talked about was the quality of attention in the room during those 7 minutes. There is a thing that happens on a television stage when the material stops being material and becomes something else. It is unmistakable to anyone who has been in enough rooms when it happens. The air changes. The lights seem to dim slightly, even though nothing has been adjusted. People stop watching a show and start watching each other watch something that is no longer a show. That happened on July 2nd, 1974, in the last 7 minutes of a segment between a comedian in a red blazer and a late-night host who had spent 11 years learning how to make 11 years look effortless. It happened because one man said a true thing by accident, and the other man was paying close enough attention to recognize it and refused to let it pass. Bob Newhart went on to run The Bob Newhart Show for 4 more seasons. He would return to television again and again over the following decades, accumulating a body of work so consistent and so warmly regarded that critics eventually ran out of new ways to describe how good he was and simply started saying his name as if that said enough, which it did. He never threw the piece of paper away. He said so in an interview in 1987, the only time he ever referenced it publicly. He said he had moved it from desk to desk across 4 different homes, and that it had gotten soft along the fold lines from being opened and closed so many times that he was afraid one day it would simply fall apart. He said he was not ready for that. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992 after 30 years. In his final monologue, he said something that most people attributed to his love of the job and his gratitude for the audience. He said, "The only honest thing I can tell you is that I was afraid every single night, every one of them, and I came anyway." People assumed he was talking about himself. People who were in Studio One on July 2, 1974 knew he was also talking about a man in a red blazer with a geometric tie who had walked through an open door 16 years into a successful career and said the thing out loud that both of them had been carrying alone. Fear is not the opposite of doing the thing. Fear is just what the thing feels like from the inside. Two men figured that out together on a July evening in Burbank in front of 280 people and a camera that kept rolling because nobody told it to stop. And somewhere at home, in a drawer that has moved across 4 different houses and gotten soft along the fold lines, there is a piece of paper with reasons written in handwriting from 1958. It is still there. If this story reached something inside you, do not wait to let someone know. Smash that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you stories like this one. The moments that happen behind the jokes and the lights and the carefully maintained surfaces of the people who made us feel less alone. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. Tell me about the drawer you keep. Tell me about the piece of paper you have never thrown away, because I think more people have one than anyone realizes. Share this with one person in your life who needed to hear that the fear does not make you a fraud, it makes you human. And hit that like button if you believe that the bravest thing any of us can do is show up anyway, night after night, and call it what we do. Because somewhere right now, someone is sitting at a desk with a piece of paper they wrote when they were 28 years old, and they are trying to decide whether to quit. Let them know they are not the only ones who kept the list. Let them know everyone kept the list. Let them know the list is not a reason to stop. It never was.